In macroeconomics, we study two fundamental problems: inflation and unemployment. So in macroeconomics, we draw models, make illustrations, and basically have graphs to help illustrate these fundamental problems and how the economy will correct the problems, whether it's with self-correction, laissez-faire economics, where the government does nothing, fiscal policy, where the government steps in with taxing or spending to try to fix one of those problems, or monetary policy, where the Federal Reserve will step in with its tools, reserve requirement, over market operations, and the discount rate, to again try to correct one of these two fundamental problems. We've already shown several models that illustrate these problems in macroeconomics. One of those was one of the first models we did in macroeconomics, the PPC, that we could show that a point inside the PPC curve would represent unemployment because resources are not being used, particularly the labor resource. In macroeconomics, we know the PPC represents a society using all of its resources, meaning all of its land, labor, and capital to produce resources. And if a society chooses, or not necessarily chooses, but a society has a resource not being used, like labor, well then that's inside the curve, and that would represent unemployment. If labor is not all being used, then unemployment would be inside the curve. Another graph we've used in macroeconomics is the business cycle. We know with the business cycle that we have up and down phases. The up phase being expansion, the down phase being a contraction. And we know in the business cycle that we know the up phase represents inflation, particularly demand pull inflation. We know that the down phase, or contraction, represents unemployment, or particularly cyclical unemployment. So we could illustrate unemployment on the business cycle just like we can on the PPC. We know that unemployment and inflation historically often have an inverse relationship, that when unemployment is occurring in the business naturally, that demand pull inflation is not occurring. When demand pull inflation is occurring during an expansion, there's low unemployment. And again, whenever there's cyclical unemployment, there's typically low inflation. Generally, that's the case. There is one exception. If there was happened to be cost push inflation, we would have an abnormal contraction because we have unemployment with some inflation going along. We know that it's stagflation. So then, because of this trend historically, a curve was developed by an economist from New Zealand, A.W. Phillips. Bill Phillips develops a curve to help illustrate the fact that inflation and unemployment are often inversely related in an economy. Okay? So, with this curve known as the Phillips curve, right, you can actually illustrate it with inflation on the vertical axis and unemployment on the horizontal axis. Go ahead and write out the words inflation rate and unemployment rate. So, we also now know that there is a long-run Phillips curve which helps to illustrate that at a natural rate of unemployment, that a society is at its potential, right? So we have our natural rate of unemployment of 4 to 6% unemployment. This natural rate of unemployment is a society at full employment. However, we also say that historically there's an inverse relationship between inflation rate and unemployment rate. So this becomes known as the Phillips curve. So that when inflation rate is high, unemployment rate is low. When the unemployment rate is high, the inflation rate is low. So, this Phillips curve is very similar, we already now know, to our long-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply curve. to the point that, for all intents and purposes, the SRAS and the SRPC are mirror image curves. They are representing the same thing. The natural rate of unemployment of 4 to 6% unemployment is the output of a society at full employment. We know that an output of society at full employment is a society using all of its labor. All the labor is being used. Exactly the same thing as the natural rate of unemployment. So the long-run Phillips curve is representing a society at full potential. The long-run aggregate supply curve is representing the society at its full employment. It's the same thing. It's just reversed in that the horizontal axis on the Phillips curve represents that as more and more people are unemployed, less and less stuff is getting made. The horizontal axis on the SRAS, AS, AD, LRAS curve is representing that, oh, more and more stuff is getting made, so therefore more and more people are getting employed. So in essence, the SRPC is basically representing a downward sloping inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. Whereas as more and more people are employed, we know that the prices get higher and aggregate demand can increase. So we have an aggregate demand curve. We have real GDP representing output as output increases, more and more people have jobs. We have the Phillips curve representing unemployment. As unemployment decreases, more and more people have jobs. So the SRPC is a mirror image of this SRAS curve. They really are. One thing we want you to remember is that as SRPC goes down, we can also on the Phillips curve represent deflation. So as you draw your Phillips curve, go ahead and take SRPC and make it negative, because that negative SRPC can help us illustrate deflation. So just remember, the SRPC and the SRAS are mirror images. They represent the same things in terms of unemployment and inflation. The LRPC and LRAS are mirror images. As LRPC would shift to the right, that means more and more people are unemployed. That would be like LRAS shifting to the left. More and more people are unemployed. Remember, the long run, the only thing that shifts the long run would be new resources or new technology. Other than that, the long run will stay there. We know that the SRPC is the same thing as the SRAS, so whatever would affect a producer would shift one of these two curves. If SRAS shifts to the right, it's like SRPC shifting to the left, and vice versa. If aggregate demand shifts, that's just going to be a movement along SRAS, which means that it would just be a movement along SRPC. For example, if AD increases and we have an increase in aggregate demand, that means that we are now at a greater price level than we were previously. Then that means that output increased. Well, that point along the curve, up and along SRAS, is just the same thing as a point up and along SRPC. Because price level increased, unemployment decreased, which means more stuff got made. Price level increased, unemployment decreased. In other words, employment increased. So these are mirror images, and it would be vice versa as well.